On June 25, 2026, a 74-year-old man was strapped to a gurney inside Florida State Prison, and when the curtain went up, he became the oldest person the state of Florida had ever executed. But 34 years before that moment, that same man had parked his car down the street from his wife's house before sunrise, pulled on a pair of clear plastic gloves, slipped a steak knife into his pocket, and walked toward her front door while the neighborhood was still dark. What happened next was heard by Karen's 18-year-old son, Timothy, who grabbed a rifle from his mother's bedroom and ran outside. When he came around to the backyard, a man was on top of her, hitting her in the head with a brick. There was blood all over her face. Timothy aimed the rifle at the man on top of his mother and pulled the trigger. It misfired. So he swung the gun like a bat and cracked it across the man's skull so hard the rifle shattered on impact. But the man did not stop. By the time police arrived, Karen was dead in her own backyard. The medical examiner would later confirm that she had been alive and conscious for every single wound on her body. And the man responsible was Dusty Ray Spencer. But Dusty wasn't always the man investigators would come to know that day. Before he became a killer, Dusty was a United States Marine. He served as a Lance Corporal, trained as a rescue diver, and participated in rescue missions in the Philippines, where his job was pulling people out of the water and keeping them alive. That matters because years later, he would tell a friend over beers that he wanted to take his wife out on the boat and throw her overboard. The man who once saved lives in the ocean wanted to use it to take one. By the early 1990s, Dusty was 40 years old and had built what looked like a normal life with his wife Karen Spencer in Orange County, Florida. They ran a painting business together, shared a home, and lived with Karen's 18-year-old son, Timothy Johnson, from a previous relationship. But by the fall of 1991, Karen wanted out of the marriage, and in early December she asked Dusty to leave the house. That was the first time she asked him to leave, but she would have to ask 2 more times. And each time, he came back worse. On December 10th, Dusty returned to confront Karen about money she had pulled from their shared business account, and within minutes, the argument turned into an assault. He choked her, he hit her, and then he told her to her face that he was going to kill her. Karen called the police, and Dusty was arrested. But even from a jail cell, he was not finished. The next day, he called Karen and told her he was going to finish what he had started as soon as he got out. He said it the next morning, sober from behind bars, after a full night to think about what he had done and what he still planned to do. And what Karen did next is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with. She let him come back for the holidays anyway. He spent Christmas at the house. They exchanged gifts, sat down to dinner with her parents and Timothy, and for a few days, it probably looked like everything was fine. But when the holidays were over, Karen asked him to leave again. That was the second time. On New Year's Day, 1992, Dusty was drinking with friends at a company workshed and told one of them that he ought to take Karen out on the boat and throw her overboard. The man thought he was joking. But 2 days later, Dusty told him that Karen was not going out on the boat anymore. He wasn't cooling off, he was changing the plan. On the morning of January 4th, Dusty came back and got into another fight with Karen in her bedroom. Timothy was asleep but woke up to the sound of his mother and found Dusty on top of her, hitting her. When Timothy tried to pull him off, Dusty grabbed a clothes iron off a shelf and cracked the boy across the head with it, then followed him back to his bedroom and hit him several more times. Then Dusty looked at an 18-year-old kid and said, "You're next. I don't want any witnesses." Karen fled to a neighbor's house for help, and when Timothy tried to call 911, Dusty ripped the phone cord out of the wall and then left town. Both of them ended up in the hospital. Karen's wounds were consistent with being struck by an iron, and the doctor had to close her face with 11 stitches. But nobody intervened. Not after the choking, not after the death threat from jail, and not after the iron attack that put both Karen and Timothy in the hospital. After this attack, Karen asked Dusty to stay away for good. That was the 3rd time she asked him to leave. On the morning of January 18, 1992, 2 weeks later, Dusty came back one final time. And everything about how he arrived tells you this was not a man in a rage. He parked his car away from the house so it would not be seen. He put on clear plastic gloves. He had a steak knife in his pocket. And when they tested his blood alcohol level after the arrest, it came back at 0, not impaired, not buzzed. Stone cold sober at dawn, gloved, with a blade, approaching on foot so nobody would hear his engine. Moments later, Timothy woke up from the commotion, grabbed a rifle from his mother's bedroom, and ran outside. In the backyard, he saw Dusty hitting Karen in the head with a brick, blood already covering her face. Timothy aimed the rifle at the man who was attacking his mother and pulled the trigger. But the gun misfired. If that rifle had gone off, Karen might still be alive today. But it did not, and Timothy would live inside that moment for the next 34 years. He swung the rifle like a bat and smashed it across Dusty's skull hard enough to shatter the weapon. But it did not matter. Dusty pulled up Karen's nightgown and told her, "Show your boy your pussy." He said that to a woman who was bleeding from her head and face in front of her own son, who had just tried to save her life with a rifle that would not fire. Then he grabbed her head and slammed the back of it into the concrete wall of the house 3 times. She was still conscious after the first impact and told him to stop. But he did not stop. When Timothy tried to carry his mother away from the wall, Dusty pulled out the knife and pointed it at the boy. Timothy had no choice. He ran to a neighbor to call for help, and by the time the police arrived, his mother was dead. Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Dr. William R. Anderson performed the autopsy. Karen had been stabbed 4 or 5 times in the chest, with 2 wounds penetrating her heart and lung. A large slash ran across her face and down her neck. She had defensive wounds on her right hand, meaning she had been awake and fighting back with her bare hands before Dusty slammed her skull into the concrete and knocked her unconscious. The defensive wounds came first. She was fighting for her life before her head hit the wall. Dr. Anderson estimated she lived for 10 to 15 minutes after receiving the stab wounds. Every injury on her body happened while she was still alive. Dusty was arrested that same day. At trial, the prosecution walked the jury through every step: the choking, the jail call, the boat comment to Benjamin Abrams, the iron attack on January 4th, and the final morning with the gloves and the knife. The defense brought in a clinical psychologist named Dr. Kathleen Birch, who testified that Dusty had a paranoid personality disorder and believed Karen was trying to steal his painting business, and a neuropharmacologist who admitted Dusty's blood alcohol level was 0, but argued he was suffering from a severe prolonged hangover. A man who drove to his wife's house at dawn parked down the street, put on plastic gloves, and brought a knife, and the defense said it was a prolonged hangover. But the court gave it almost no weight. The jury convicted Dusty of first-degree murder, aggravated assault, attempted second-degree murder, and aggravated battery. By a vote of 7 to 5, they recommended death. The judge followed the recommendation and sentenced Dusty to death in December 1992, finding the murder especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Dusty appealed his death sentence, and the court sent it back to be reconsidered. But it did not help him. On January 18, 1995, exactly 3 years to the day after he murdered Karen, he was sentenced to death again. He spent the next 31 years trying to get off death row. He appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, to the federal courts, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But none of it worked. Every single road was closed. In the spring of 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant and scheduled the execution for June 25th. By then, Dusty was 74 years old with liver disease and failing health, and his legal team argued that his age and the lethal injection protocol violated the 8th Amendment. The Florida Supreme Court rejected every argument and issued the mandate immediately. But it was not just the courts that were asked to intervene. Petitions circulated calling for clemency. Anti-death penalty organizations described what happened to Karen as one tragic act of violence and asked the public to consider the role of childhood trauma in shaping adult behavior. And that was not it. Dusty's spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, called the scheduled execution a nursing home execution. He described Dusty's skin as old and frail, saying it would need to be pulled tight just to run the IV. He wrote that no old man should die alone among strangers, and that there was already a death moving toward Dusty that the state did not need to rush, that they should let it come on its own time. He also said he understood that Karen's family would want to see Dusty executed, but that the real way to honor her memory was to quit killing people. In the days before June 25th, Dusty sent a message through his advisor to the public. "I want the people of Florida to know that I love God. I'm sorry for what I did, and no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay." Karen Spencer was not given the chance to be okay. She was never given 34 years to find peace, or a last meal, or a chance to say goodbye. She never got to tell anyone she was going to be okay. But Dusty did get all of those things, and then, on June 25th, 2026, his time finally ran out. That morning, Dusty woke up at 5:30 in his cell at Florida State Prison. According to a spokesman, he remained calm and compliant throughout the day. He got a visit from his spiritual advisor, and for his final meal, he requested a pizza, French fries, and a milkshake. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Dusty was already strapped to a metal table with an IV in his arm. His spiritual advisor sat at the foot of the gurney. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Dusty said, Sorry to the family. Into thy hands I commit my spirit and my soul. I'm on my way, Lord, I'm on my way. Amen." Immediately after his statement, the lethal drugs began flowing. After a few minutes of labored breathing, Dusty stopped moving. The warden shook him and shouted his name several times, but there was no response. A medic was called in to check his vital signs, and Dusty Ray Spencer was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. He was 74 years old and had spent more than half his life on death row. What do you think? Has justice been served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.